Tonight's program, we're pleased to welcome Bill Deen back to Third Thursday. Bill was one of our last speakers back in January of 2020 before COVID shut everything down. And a little over a year ago, he did a Zoom program for us on Colorado steam. Bill's a retired engineering professor who for many years has photographed operating steam in the United States, Canada, and a few places overseas. He's also a model railroader focusing on Pacific Northwest logging and HO scale, unless he's changed the focus of that in the last couple of years. For the past several years, Bill has served as an officer and director of the Friends of Bedford Depot Park and is currently the group's acting president following the untimely death of Jim Shea late last year. His recently published new book, Minuteman Railroad, Boston and Maine's Lexington branch, traces the long and colorful history of the branch, which operated northwest of Boston from 1846 to 1981. Although the rails are gone now, the route lives on as the hugely popular Minuteman Bikeway. Bill's program tonight is based on his research for the book. As I noted, if you have any questions, please note the slide number during Bill's program. So, Bill, welcome back to Mass Bay RE. And
I'll just say again, I did not work on, nor did I ever actually ride the Lexington branch, although I lived in Bedford a long time. But I have spent quite a bit of time looking into its history, and happy to share that with you. So I was saying the B&M system was pretty still a formidable regional railroad as of 1941. As you can see here on the map, its lines extended into Maine and New Hampshire and New York as well, and Vermont as well as Massachusetts. The Lexington branch was a tiny part of that, only about 1%, just immediately northwest of Boston. Lexington branch was typical in some ways, but very atypical in others. It was typical in that for decades, as with many other Boston, Maine branches, it was mogul country. And here are a couple of 260s preparing to leave Bedford early on a morning in 1953. The lead engine is actually having trouble. They're hung up on some switch points. Here's a view of the same scene from the other direction, and the crew is looks like they're using a pry bar to try to get reposition the points. Anyway, all was fixed. The first train departed 10 minutes late, but that was a morning in the life there in Bedford. On the right here in this view is the Bedford Freight House. You'll be hearing more about. It's in the middle distance in this view, and it's one of the preserved buildings in Bedford Depot Park that I'll be telling you more about later on. So the branch was typical in some ways, but was very atypical in others, and I'll be sharing some of its peculiarities as we go along. But first, let's talk about some of the geography. On the left is a map that shows about a 20 by 20 square mile or 20 by 20 mile area northwest of Boston. As most of you know, the original Boston and Lowell Main line went northwest from Boston through Winchester, Wilmington, North Billerica up to Lowell in 1835. By 1846, the Fitchburg Railroad was established from Boston to Fitchburg, and it went through West Cambridge, Waltham, near the bottom of the map on the left panel, Concord, and then out through Fitchburg, and was on its way eventually, of course, through the Hoosac Tunnel in New York State. Now, in between the Boston and Lowell and the Fitchburg was a space that was ultimately, actually in just a few years after the Fitchburg started, occupied by the Lexington branch. And that area in between those two main lines was in contention between the two regionals, the Boston and Lowell and the Fitchburg. The Lexington branch, which is shown in red, ran through from sort of the West Cambridge area out through Arlington and Lexington to Bedford. One fork of it then went to Concord, and for some years to an obscure connection with another what was ultimately a New Haven line at a place called Middlesex Junction. And the last piece of it went from Bedford directly north to Billerica. So the branch had a Y shape. The map on the right shows all the stations. At its peak around 1900, there were actually 22 stations. It served 5 towns: Arlington, Lexington, Bedford, Concord, and Billerica, and each of the towns had several stations. From Arlington out to Lexington Center, they were less than a mile apart. Most of you are aware that Boston is surrounded by hills on the north and west. There is a fault line and an uplifting that created hills that go up to about 350 feet in elevation, and they're just a handful of natural pathways through those ridges, one of which is Mill Brook in Arlington. So the railroad chose to follow that valley from Arlington up to Lexington, where its summit was, a little over 200 feet. Following the Millbrook Valley kept the reeling grade to 1.3%. There was a similar grade going down then to Bedford, and from Bedford on to Concord. On the top right diagram there was nearly level. And the last piece, the fork that went from Bedford up to Billerica, had a choppier profile. Again, a couple of summits over 200 feet, probably more than its share of curvature, because it was built largely on an abandoned narrow gauge right of way, which we'll talk about a little bit. The picture shows a train descending into Arlington on the 1.3% in the Millbrook Valley. Well, the origins of the branch have to do with actually 3 bodies of water, which are shown nicely on this 1891 atlas. First body of water was Boston Harbor, and in particular near the right side, 2/3 of the way down, the deep water docks in Charlestown at the mouth of the Charles River. The other 2 bodies of water were the 2 ponds that you see in kind of the left center: Fresh Pond in today's Arlington, and Spy Pond in today's, Fresh Pond in today's Cambridge, Spy Pond in today's Arlington, each about ½ mile in diameter. What connected them and led to the conditions that allowed the Lexington branch to get a start was a very improbable industry, largely forgotten today, and that was the export of natural ice. For millennia, of course, people in cities and towns had hacked ice from frozen lakes and rivers for local use, but the idea of exporting it to tropical ports was that of Bostonian Frederick Tudor, who in his 20s just came up with this idea that he could get the ice there intact and find somebody to buy it. And he, after many years of experimentation and nearly going broke, he developed markets, developed production and storage methods, transportation methods, and began to make it a success. He became known as the Ice King and actually died a rich man. One of the keys to having long-lasting blocks of ice was to cut them in very regular rectangular chunks. There's an 1830s drawing there on the top left that shows people doing it. It requires some specialized tools, some of which were manufactured right on the banks of Spy Pond in Arlington by the William T. Wood factory. At the peak of his operation, there were others that were involved in the ice export, but Tudor was the biggest player. He had his own wharves in Charlestown, as you can see on the top right, and each of those sailing ships you see are loading cargoes for the Caribbean or places even more distant. He began by selling ice to ports like Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, and Havana, and eventually reached the Far East. And in fact, his first shipment to ice in the early 1830s to Calcutta caused a sensation there. Well, as the ice trade grew to tens of thousands of tons export per year, the horse-drawn wagons over the dirt roads at the time could no longer keep up with the need to transfer the ice 4 miles from the fresh pond and spy pond to the docks, and so a railroad was badly needed. And that's where railroad chronology comes in. The diagram on the left is a schematic version of the Lexington branch and connection. It's a little easier than the more to talk about than the more scale version. The need to provide transportation from Fresh Pond to the Charlestown docks was satisfied by the Charlestown Branch Railroad, which is the first railroad that actually connected the Boston and Lowell to the Charlestown docks. And they built west 4 miles because of the ice trade in 1842 to a place came to be called Brickyards. Fitchburg, in just a couple of years, gained control of the Charlestown branch, and by 1846, it owned that track and had extended west, as I said earlier, to Fitchburg and beyond. With the first 4 miles having been built by the Charlestown branch, the citizens of Lexington and what is today Arlington, what was then the town of West Cambridge, decided that they would be able to finance themselves a short line, which would give those towns their first rail service, and they were able to do the financing for the next 7 miles out to Lexington, and it opened as the Lexington and West Cambridge Railroad in 1846. To make a long story short, the Lexington West Cambridge struggled. It was nearly bankrupt by the end of the Civil War, and looking for an owner. The Fitchburg, which had never been a particularly friendly connection, was uninterested. But the Boston and Lowell was, and its purchase of the Lexington West Cambridge, the locally owned railroad in 1869, began a kind of a golden age for what would later be called the Lexington branch. The first thing that Boston and Lowell did was to build a cutoff from East Arlington to its main line at Somerville Junction, so that all the traffic off the branch could get to Boston on its entirely on home rails, and of course, take all that traffic away from the Fitchburg. Shortly after that, it formed a subsidiary called the Middlesex Central to extend the branch. Middlesex Central built through Bedford to Concord in 1873, a few years later to Reformatory, the site of a brand new state prison, and that Middlesex Junction connection with originally the Framingham and Lowell. And then in 1885, the other fork was completed by the Boston and Lowell from Bedford to North Billerica. So something like maybe 4 different companies were involved over a 40-year period to assemble this, what was at most 27 miles of railroad. The way I've drawn the diagram there on the bottom left suggests an answer to the following riddle, and that is, how can a branch from Boston become 2 miles longer and not affect the travel distance of any trains on the branch? And the answer is that the newer route via Somerville Junction was within about 100 feet of the same length as the original route via Brickyards. And so when the change was made in the Boston end of the branch, none of the mileposts beyond Arlington had to be changed. That wasn't the only time the end of the branch was changed. In 1927, it was changed back again to its original location. By then, the Boston, Maine owned all the trackage, and so that was home rails were not an issue. And so, for reasons unrelated to the branch, it was moved back. So the Boston end was moved twice without changing the distance of any trip on it to North Station. Well, in time, traffic was lost to, ultimately to motor vehicles. The The trackage beyond Bedford was all abandoned in 1962. And there was a gradual decline. The last passenger train ran in 1977, the last freight in 1981. And as Dave mentioned, the right-of-way from Arlington to Bedford is now occupied by the very popular Minuteman bikeway. The Lexington branch began and ended with ice. The drawing there on the left is of a sister engine to the one that pulled the first train out of Lexington in 1846. It was a locomotive that the Charlestown branch had bought and named in honor of its main customer, Frederick Tudor. So it was called the Tudor. When the Fitchburg absorbed the Charlestown branch, it got the engine, and at its beginning, the Lexington West Cambridge operated on lease by the Fitchburg, and so it was that engine turned out to be the one that pulled the first train. The last train was also related to, or the occasion was related to ice, and that is a northeaster and a extensive accumulation of snow, and even worse than that, icing of flangeways over the entire branch caused the train to be stranded in Bedford in January 77. It was a single RDC then that, because of the weather, was being assisted by the switcher you see there, B&M 1132. The equipment was stuck there for several days, and without any formal announcement, that was actually the end of passenger service on the branch. So there was no warning, and there was no actual announcement actually until March. So beginning and end with ice. Now, by the 1970s, the Lexington branch was a pretty sleepy operation. It was down then to a single daily round trip from Bedford into North Station. After 1958, all trains were RDCs, first three, then two, and up to mid-1973, and finally one. Here's a great shot by Loring Lawrence, who hiked along the embankment of Route 2 near the Arlington Lexington border to catch an evening outbound in April of 73. The lead RDC, which you'll hear much more about, was the B&M 6211, an RDC2 baggage passenger. In the distance, the high-rise buildings are public housing along Ringe Avenue in West Cambridge. And the white tank and a smaller tank there also was part of an Amoco bulk distribution facility, and that is the location of today's Alewife T-stop parking garage. The Lexington branch began as a country short line. It became much more than that, as I'll say in a minute, and then it kind of ended as a country short line. I think that is captured well in Rick Conard's photo here of the folks boarding in East Lexington, the one daily Boston train in late 1973. By then, it was a single RDC. Now, anyone who knew the branch in its later years would have been very hard put to imagine that it was once an incredibly busy railroad. We don't have traffic figures for most years, so the best we can do is use the number of weekday round trips as a measure of how much passenger traffic there was on the branch. You can see here is that in 1900, when service peaked, there were no fewer than 29 daily round trips as far out as Arlington, about half that number to Bedford. There was also a round trip local freight, so that's 30 round trips or 60 steam trains per day in Arlington, over an 18-hour operating day that works out to be about one steam train about every 18 minutes. Very hard to imagine for anyone still living, actually. Well, the buildup prior to 1900 is mostly the work of the Boston and Lowell. They not only uh, tripled the length of the branch, but they tripled or even quadrupled the number of trains. From 1890 to 1900, 1910, the Lowell or the branch was by then operated by the Boston Maine, which is leased the Boston Lowell in 1887. High level of service which was retained until the bottom started to fall out in the years before World War I. 1914 saw about half, or actually 2/3 of the trains removed, and then there's another big reduction in 1926 when another half, were cut out. So, but at its peak, it was a heavy-duty railroad. The Lexington branch was double-tracked as far out as Lexington. Photo on the left shows the double track right away in Arlington Heights. Anyone from just a photo would have been hard put to distinguish it from a B&M main line. Like the main lines at the time, it was equipped with automatic block signals. Even had its own interlocking tower, which I'm led to believe was unique among B&M branches, and was even the middle section of a Boston and Lowell RPO route for about 20 years. Here's where the branch crossed Mass Avenue in North Cambridge. The double track branch is coming in there from the left center, exiting on the right. It's crossing the double track trolley line of the Boston Elevated. You see all the manually operated crossing gates. And then in the left distance, you see the interlocking tower I was referring to. Now, the map at the bottom will orient you a bit. It and the other track maps I'll be showing you were traced by me from scans of original Boston, Maine blueprints, all dated in 1914. Fortunately, there were not actually too many track changes after that. So what I will be showing you is often very representative of later years. In this case, the photographer was standing near the left edge of the map at the intersection of Cameron Avenue and Mass Ave, pointing the camera toward the right, kind of a westerly direction, and toward the place where the Central Mass joined the Lexington branch. In fact, the reason for the tower was it was a junction point between those two branches, and the Central Mass and Lexington branch shared trackage from there as far as Somerville Junction, where the branch joined the main line. I should only warn you that all the track maps I'll be showing you are kind of backwards in the sense that up is south and generally, and down is north, and that's the way the Boston Maine drew them, so that's the way I drew them. So what caused the erosion of traffic after 1900? Well, the first big factor was the arrival of a closely paralleling street railway. The Lexington and Boston Street Railway, which arrived in 1900, ran from Arlington Heights out through Lexington Center to Bedford, forked there, as did the Lexington branch, to Concord and to Billerica, was never more than about half a mile away from the Lexington branch. And the trolleys were cheap. They ran at one time every 15 minutes, and they probably almost immediately siphoned away most of the local traffic. The longer distance traffic held up better because the trolleys, although they were cheap and frequent, they could not match the speed of the trains for people commuting into Boston from certainly as far out as Bedford, or even Lexington. The railroad was still pretty competitive. So even after the first big set of cuts occurred in 1914, and those are attributable to the arrival of the trolleys, motor vehicles, or certainly private cars, were not yet a big factor before World War I. But so even after the big loss of 2/3 of the trains due to the trolley competition occurred, there was still a lot of service on the Lexington branch. And here's an extract from information extracted from a timetable in 1920 when they were 12 daily outbounds on weekdays and 10 daily inbounds. Trains out on the branch originated in Arlington and Bedford on the main stem. There were several trains that originated or terminated in Lowell via the branch. And there was even still one round trip that terminated as far out as Reformatory on the other fork of the branch, although Reformatory traffic would, or traffic on that branch would disappear the first, and it would be the first part to be abandoned. In the 1920s, the Lexington branch, as a former Boston and Lowell property, was still using the Boston and Lowell part of what was then called North Union Station, and that's shown on the photo on the bottom right. The higher numbered trains were from the Boston and Lowell part of the station. Well, so after the next set of cuts occurred in 1926, the branch was down to 5 weekday round trips. The schedule stayed as shown here on the top or on the left for over 20 years, and we just so happened from an internal B&M report dated 1942, some very specific data on the motive power and passengers, and that and the longevity of this particular schedule, I think, makes it worth spending a few minutes talking about it. So the way things worked was this. 3 engines, all moguls at the time, were based out in Bedford at its engine terminal to power early morning trains into Boston, 3202, 6, and 10. I call them here engines A, B, and C. Now, engine A, which had gone in first, came back out on train 3203 out to Bedford. It met 3210 in Lexington, where there was a passing siding. And after coming out to Bedford, turned and then went back in again on 3212 to provide a 4th morning inbound. So pretty good service in that part of the branch. By this time, even actually after 1933, there was no passenger service beyond Bedford. Skip over train 3207, which was Saturday only, and look at 3211, 15, 17. Those were the first 3 trains in the outbound evening rush from Boston to Bedford. They returned the 3 moguls where they were kept overnight. And then a 4th afternoon or early evening outbound was provided by a crew out of Boston, and was normally Atlantic. Its return to Boston amounted almost to a deadhead run, as you can see. So as shown in the right column, 1,000 passengers per day, or about 500 round trips, still as late as 1942. Now I'm going to take you on a tour of the branch. We're going to go south to north. By the way, the outbound trains were always railroad north, not railroad west, and inbound trains were always railroad south, not railroad east. And we'll start in later years where the branch connected with the Fitchburg and the Fitchburg Division main line in West Cambridge. So this is an aerial view looking toward the northwest over part of West Cambridge. The Fitchburg main is running from the bottom center up to the top left. The extra trackage at the top left was the West Cambridge freight yard. The Lexington branch is curving in from the top center, and it joins it joined the Fitchburg main at a crossover right next to the word division in Fitchburg Division. Now, every day for years, I drove in on Alewife Parkway to get to work in East Cambridge, and was totally unaware that this entire part of West Cambridge was once covered by clay pits, and brickworks. And the last survivors was Newlingham Brick. Plant is shown there. The big pond, kind of the right center, was a flooded clay pit. The pond beyond it is also a flooded clay pit. That one is still there. The one in the center was filled in the area around Ringe Avenue and along Alewife Parkway totally redeveloped into housing and shopping. So the area looks nothing like this at all today. Those high-rise public housing buildings that you saw in the earlier view of the outbound RDCs in West Cambridge were located right where the word Ringe is. They're along Ringe Avenue, and the Alewife T-stop is above that, just on the other side of Alewife Brook Parkway. Many changes since the 40s. Here's a view from the Alewife Brook Bridge over the tracks, looking now east, and this New England brick on the far left. Tracks in the foreground, far left is the Lexington branch. Next, joining it at the switch there is the Central Mass. The switch in the center leads to the West Cambridge Freight Yard. Then you've got the double track Fitchburg Division, Maine. Then a running track for local switching, and then the west leg of the Y that went to the Watertown branch. And a nice view by Albert Hale of a Boston Mechanicville hotshot powered by one of the Boston, Maine's R1 mountains. So we're going to continue our trip north on the branch, and I'll be going back and forth over time and telling you things about each of these places. Here's the local freight. It's just gone under Route 2. You can see the overpass in the background. The local freight, oddly, unlike most regularly scheduled freights on the B&M, did not have a symbol. It was simply called by operating personnel. Originally the Bedford and Billerica, and then the B&B, and finally just the BB. So that's what it was called. Today it looks almost heavy enough to have to double the hill up to Lexington, and if so, they would have left part of the train actually very near the site of this photo in East Arlington. First passenger stop on the branch was at Lake Street in Arlington. Arlington had 4 passenger stops. All the depots on the branch were different than one another. The one at Lake Street was a very unusual masonry construction there with brick arches over the windows. And the main picture here shows that last evening outbound 2-car train powered by an Atlantic, 1948. The guy walking to the right has gotten off the train on the wrong side. He's walking over toward the depot building, which is out of the picture on the right. One of the peculiarities of the Lexington branch is it's 2 of its lowly commuter trains had names. They were the featured outbound was called the Paul Revere, and that's shown here. The featured inbound was called the Patriot. Here's the Paul Revere leaving Lake Street. It was in the late 40s. By then, the B&M was starting to introduce steel equipment, and a 7-car train was too heavy for a mogul to keep the schedule. And so here and in many of the other photos you'll see of it, it was powered by a K7 light consolidation. The truck in the background, by the way, is on Lake Street, and you can just see the depot opposite the end of the train. Well, these names, the Patriot and the Paul Revere, which are, I think, quite unusual for commuter trains, came about in a kind of an odd way, and I'll show you that story of where they came from. They appeared on public timetables as late as 1958, but they originated in 1926 with a big PR blunder that the B&M committed. They announced on January 15th that they were in 2 weeks they were going to reduce the passenger service on the branch from 19 to 6 trains. The response from the community was an overwhelming attendance at the DPU hearing that was scheduled a couple weeks after that. There were representatives from each of the town governments, from every civic organization you can imagine, and private individuals, and and caused the hearing to be delayed to February. In the meantime, the local citizens organized and formed something they called the Lexington Branch Protective Committee. It was chaired by George Diamond of Bedford. The town of Lexington and the town of Bedford each called emergency special town meetings to appropriate money for the legal expenses of the Protective Committee. The committee didn't fool around. They hired as their attorney Edgar Rich, who had been formerly the chief counsel of the Boston and Maine. He promptly pointed out that the B&M and the way they'd gone about the train offs had violated state laws in terms of public notice, and that bought the citizenry and the Minuteman town some more time. In the meantime, from February to March, the Protective Committee negotiated with the B&M, and they came up with a compromise that pretty well satisfied everyone's needs. It kept 10 rather than 6 trains on the branch and still allowed the Boston, Maine to reduce its losses. So the new schedule took effect in April, and I think realizing that they had made a lot of people upset in these towns, that as a kind of a conciliatory gesture, the B&M named 2 of the commuter trains the Patriot and the Paul Revere at the end of that year. Well, as Paul himself would have said, we need to get going. So let's continue our journey north. This is a neat old pictorial atlas of showing Arlington in 1884. The Lexington branch comes into the picture at the lower right. Lake Street is that first grade crossing. We've left that. Notice along the east edge of Spy Pond, we're angling up toward the up and left toward the center of the atlas here. Notice the big ice houses that even in 1884, when the ice industry was in decline, still lined Spy Pond. Those the ones on the east side were served by the Lexington branch. The ones on the south side were served by a spur off of the Fitchburg at that time. The tracks then crossed Mass Avenue. That's the sort of the main road running left to right in the center of the picture. Soon after that was the Arlington Center Depot, and then climbing up the valley, there was a stop at Brattle and a stop at Arlington Heights that we'll get to momentarily. Here's the Arlington Center Depot that dated from the early 1880s. Another one of the track maps. Tracks coming into the depot from Boston, from Lake Street, crossed Mass Ave. The depot itself was kind of in the shadow of the old town hall in Arlington. Across the tracks from it was a long-lived coal yard owned by Person Wynn. It's the local pronunciation, and it was a customer of the railroad for many decades. And then continuing on north or geographic west was the little freight yard in Arlington beyond Water Street. The photo on the top right is the photographer standing on the outbound Maine, looking back toward the depot area. There's the coal dealer on the left. You can see the depot on the right, and behind it with a tall cupola is the old town hall. What helps date that photo is the cupola was destroyed by a lightning strike in the early 1920s. So the photos from before that. I love this view of an early 1926 station stop in Arlington Center, outbound train. This is the train that would soon be called the Paul Revere. You can see the big pile of express being unloaded onto a cart on the platform. There's a express truck waiting next to the depot, ready to deliver some of those packages. And of course, trains were kid magnets, as well as magnets for other people just coming to wanting to look at all the excitement. By the way, this is near the end of when 10-wheelers were still used, I think, on the trains in the Lexington branch. This is 1926. Shortly after that, the power seems to have been, for many years, almost exclusively moguls on the branch until the odd Atlantic was introduced. Jumping ahead 30 years, there's an inbound making its station stop at Arlington. The depot is starting to look a little bit worse for wear at the ornamental ironwork. Go back here that it used to have. See in the top left, all the gingerbread. That's gone now. The canopies are kind of sagging a little bit, but it's still very functional and very well patronized, even in 1956. This is 2 weeks before the final end of steam on the branch. It had dieselization was supposed to have occurred a year earlier, but a snowstorm caused the diesels to be needed elsewhere, and there was a 3-week reprieve of steam in March and April 1956 that brought the by then Pacifics back on the what was then 2 daily round trips. So I mentioned the Mass Avenue crossing. It's a photo by Alan Thomas from about 1950, and as he put it in his notes, here is a MTA Type 5 trolley glaring at a Lexington branch train crossing in front of it and on Mass Ave. This crossing, as was the Mass Ave crossing I showed you earlier in North Cambridge, a big headache operationally. It was once equipped with manually operated crossing gates, as were most of the grade crossings on the branch. And they had been taken out by the 1930s and replaced by traffic signals that were controlled by watchmen, and then eventually when the watchmen were eliminated by the train crews. And every employee timetable had a paragraph of special instructions on how to work those traffic signals. Let's get back for a few minutes to the local freight. Train watchers in Lexington, Bedford, and Billerica were sometimes puzzled by the fact that the train always just operated north on the branch. And some of them even called it the train to oblivion because it never came back. And there's a reason for that operating pattern, and I'll explain that to you. So you saw earlier that here we're talking about circa 1950, that by then the passenger traffic was concentrated inbound in a couple hours in the morning and outbound a couple hours in the afternoon. So the local left Boston Mystic in late morning after the early inbound passenger trains were off the branch, worked its way north through Arlington, Lexington to Bedford, did a side trip to Concord if there was any traffic there, and had the branch to itself until actually mid-afternoon. And to avoid any conflicts with the evening passenger rush, which went at this time only as far as Bedford and didn't start until 4:30, all they had to do was just get north of Bedford by maybe 4 o'clock, 4:30. And so they operated north on the branch. They operated up to Lowell, usually, occasionally just north Billerica, turned there and returned to Boston on the Lowell-Boston Maine line. So they kind of traced a clockwise loop, and in doing so, they avoided any conflicts with passenger train. Of course, they were coming back to Boston on the main line. It was double tracked, and they were going against the main direction of passenger trains then anyway. So it was the best way to do it, even though it was puzzling for trackside observers. So this was the pattern for many years from the 1920s on until it stopped being a regular operation. Here's the local freight near the end, its last decade. Rick Connor just caught it with a kind of a tired-looking GP7 just crossing Mass Avenue into Arlington. I have to comment on the sign. The sign commemorates what's called here the Battle of Minuteman, April 19, 1775. Most of you might think of that as the day of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, but historically oriented Arlingtonians are quite sensitive about that because Arlington never gets much credit for the beginning of the revolution. And the sign points out to anyone interested that there were more casualties in the Arlington area that day, then called Minuteman, then later called West Cambridge, and then finally in 1867 renamed Arlington. But there were, anyway, more casualties there than there had been in Lexington and Concord put together. So I guess it's one of the hazards of changing your town name as you've altered your brand, and that doesn't help you get credit for things. Here's that same freight in the freight yard in west of Water Street in Arlington. The main freight customer of the branch then was an outfit called New England Farms that brought produce in from the west and repackaged it for local delivery. The street beyond the caboose is Water Street, and the siding next to the main track, which the caboose is on, the siding next to that, actually one rail length of that is still in place for some reason next to the bikeway. The bikeway is now where the main track is. Proceeding north, the next stop was Brattle, once written with an S. The depot here I found very interesting. It was the original 1846 depot from Arlington Center, which when it was outgrown there was moved here to Brattle at the next stop and converted in part to a residence for the agent. You can see the laundry hanging out back. You can get a little glimpse of a kitchen addition that was built onto the back of the depot. And on we're looking at the south end of the depot. On this end, you can see a second floor was actually added inside, taking advantage of the 16-foot ceiling originally and made into bedrooms for the agent's family. The opposite end of the first floor retained this was still the waiting room, retained its high ceiling. What dates this picture is that the branch was double tracked in 1886, and the grade crossing that you see in the distance there was replaced by a road underpass in 1900. So it's, I'll say, 1890s. Here's the same spot in the 1930s. An inbound is arriving. Now we have the underpass for Brattle Street in place, and high granite platforms have been erected as a boarding area for inbound passengers, and there's this stairway that leads up from Brattle Street up to the platforms. So now I have to tell you a story about about boarding here. Around 1950, there was a young woman that lived in the neighborhood that commuted into Boston every day that had a really hard time getting out of bed in the morning, except at the very last minute. And she was often seen running down the street under the bridge there and up that set of stairs that you see, and waving and calling to the train crew to hold on so that she could get aboard. Now this is 1950, it was a different time. The passengers mostly knew one another, and they actually instead of assaulting her, which might happen today, they got a kick out of it and used to call to the train crew, "Wait for Mary, wait for Mary." And so the stairs are still there. They lead now up to the bikeway. The bridge is still away. I think of them as Mary's Stairs. Next stop, last stop in Arlington was at Arlington Heights in the hilly west end of Arlington. This was a residential area that was developed out of the least valuable farmland in Arlington. The flat area in the 1870s was still very valuable farmland, but up in the hills, less so. And so a developer acquired that land from the descendants of pioneering families and subdivided it and created a housing for folks who wanted to get out of the city, and specifically for those who wanted to do that and would commute by rail into Boston. So here's the Paul Revere and then late 1940s train. By then, the track on the left is no longer a main, but rather it's been part of the outbound main. It's converted to passing sidings. Now, the top right, I showed you this picture earlier, and I'll draw your attention to the stairway. This is the last stairway story. The stairway that leads from the platform up to it was Park Avenue there, that first overpass in the Arlington Heights Depot there, as of course you can see on the right. If you look in the lower right, photo, here's the local, better looking Jeep in this case, arriving there at a time when after the depot had been torn down, the land had been sold to a lumber company that erected a concrete retaining wall, and the stairs had become overgrown and were closed off up at the top at Park Avenue. I'm happy to report now that, of course, now the railroad right-of-way itself is the Minuteman bikeway, and those same stairs have been restored, and they now provide access to and from between the bikeway and Park Avenue. Lexington had 5 stops, less than a mile apart, most of them. On the left, you see intermodalism, all 1894. There was a time when station agents competed with one another for who could have the nicest looking grounds. And this whole area in the foreground, right up to practically where the depot is today, the parking lot of Lexington Toyota. On the right is my favorite color action photo of a freight on the branch. This is by George M. Diamond Jr., who many of you, late George Diamond Jr., who many of you might have known. He was the son of the George Diamond who led the 1926 passenger rebellion. Next stop out, less than a mile north, was Pierce's Bridge. Perhaps my favorite depot. This was the depot there. Unfortunately, it was not preserved, dated from about 1855. The path beyond the white fence does still exist. In fact, it's paved now and provides access to the bikeway. This photo cannot be, even this angle cannot be duplicated because the area on the right is so overgrown today. Looking the other direction, during some snow, the photo on the left was actually the last run of train 3206 in 1955. After that, there were, for the next 3 years, were just the number of round trips went from 3 to 2. Less than half a mile north of Pierce's Bridge was the Monroe Depot, very bucolic spot, still is today. Between 1952 on the left and 1962 on the right, actually I can't see the date anyway, about 10 years later. The depot was raised. The garden center, which is on the other side of the track, seems to have acquired the land and used it for planting, and it remains a grassy spot, and the big trees are still there, so it's a pretty location. Woburn Street in Lexington was not a stop, but I like this Don Robinson photo because it illustrates some of the operational issues with the branch. Notice that it was still equipped in the late 40s with hand-operated gates. The shanty for the crossing watchman is just a little bit of it's just barely visible in the lower left. Here's the local arriving, and the gates are up, and a guy is down, the brakeman's down on the street flagging by hand. The reason is that by then the watchmen were only employed during the morning and afternoon passenger rushes, and the local freight, when it came out midday, was on its own, and so they had to flag this and many other grade crossings by hand. So that was an operational issue with the branch. The most well-known depot in the branch was out in Lexington Center, still there today. You can see this is kind of a view kind of toward the northwest. Mass Ave parallel to the tracks. It's out of view on the left. The street that you see crossing beyond the buildings, it's just beyond the depot, is Merriam Street. And beyond that, in the trees, is the freight house. Now, this is a photo from the 1930s. I think it was actually from 1934. Now, one thing that interested me when I studied this photo enough was that, oh, by the way, there was a meet that used to occur here every day. That was the one outbound met the third inbound here in Lexington, the sighting you see that just outside the train shed. Anyway, the sighting to the right of that got me interested because of the curve in the end. And it finally dawned on me that that must have been the lead to a turntable that once was in the spot between there and Merriam Street. The turntable was taken out in the 1890s, replaced by another one farther south in the yard. But the B&M didn't see fit to change the little curvature at the end of the track. And here is that turntable in the 1890s. A great portrait taken by Loring Lawrence's uncle, Charles Frederick Lawrence. You can see behind the tender on the left, the hand-operated gates on Merriam Street, and between them, the steeple, the First Parish Church, which is right on the northwest side of the Lexington Green. And so this is how close the tracks were to the famous Battle Green. Now, their proximity to the Green caused the railroad to be right in the middle of an epic celebration of the centennial of the beginning of the Revolution, April 19th, 1875. To prepare for that, the Middlesex Central put on extra trains. They increased the number of round trips from what was then 8 up to 12 and provided for 4 additional late night returns to Boston. It wasn't enough. Imagine inviting 10 people over for dinner and 100 show up. What happened here is that rural Lexington and rural Concord, each individually, invited the public to come, thinking that maybe 10,000 would arrive, which is greater than their own population. 100,000 people are estimated to have flooded into those towns. The railroad was overwhelmed. Thousands of people were left on at the Causeway Street Depot in Boston, unable to board. The train was running, or the railroad was running 20-car trains. Look at the line of cars there on the photo at the right. By the way, that's Merriam Street. The photo is taken from the roof of a building near the corner of Mass Ave and Merriam Street. The schedule was totally discarded. The railroad was tied up. It didn't have sidings, passing sidings for 20-car trains to begin with. Normal trains are 3 or 4 cars. The kind of poor quality but still informative picture on the lower left shows the mob on Mass Avenue in Lexington. See all the carriages, all the pedestrians, marching bands. It was almost impossible even to make headway on foot to Lexington. So it was a day in which the railroad was completely overwhelmed in a way that never had happened before or since. Well, here in quieter times in the 1950s, we have here's an inbound at Lexington Center. Looks like a classic car rally, but no, those are just commuters parked their cars there in 1954 next to the depot. Here's an inbound departing the depot. The water standpipe there was not needed by inbound passenger trains. They just come 4 miles from Bedford, but it was used by the local freight. And here is the local freight northbound in the middle of the day. It has just stopped to get water. The crew is probably taking a lunch break also, and it's getting ready to do its switching. There was still a little bit of freight activity in the yard here at that time, 1950. Going further north, a longtime customer of the railroad was Lexington Lumber near Revere Street, and the switch in the right foreground led to Lexington Lumber's sightings, and that switch actually is still present in the woods. When the track was torn up for the bikeway, the switch rails were left in place, and now there are trees growing up between the rails. Last stop in Lexington was North Lexington. Another odd situation in terms of the depot. The 2.5-story depot was originally either a residence or an inn, and in a convenient location when the railroad arrived. It predated the railroad. When the railroad arrived, they acquired it and just left it where it was, which accounts for it not being parallel to the track. A freight house parallel to the track was added onto it in a covered connection, but that's the way it's done. The street in the background is Bedford Street. And then on the right is a more modern view of the North Lexington stop and inbound, again with RDC 6211. I told you you'd hear some more about it. The depot by the 1940s had been moved elsewhere. The freight house had been raised, and the depot had been replaced by that little red-colored shack that you see on the front right, as folks get ready to board the 2 RDC inbound. Now, Bedford's importance to the railroad lay mostly in its strategic location rather than in the traffic it generated. Once the line to North Billerica was constructed and the branch took its Y shape, Bedford was a junction point. Even a couple of years before that, it had become an engine terminal. So looking at the map for orientation, the track is coming in from Lexington on the left. It splits into the what was called the Bedford and Billerica branch to Billerica, and the reformatory branch to Concord. The depot when the Billerica or the Bedford and Billerica branch was built was moved to a spot in between the two branches and equipped with train order signals at both ends. The freight house was moved shortly after 1900 to the location that you see, and the coal and grain dealer, which for many years was called Middlesex Coal and Grain, was also in place early in the century. I mentioned those 3 buildings because all 3 of them survive, and you'll see them in photos. What doesn't still survive is the Bedford engine house, which was placed inside the Y, and it's shown on the top right. An oddity there is that the switch leading to the tail track of the Y was on a little bridge over Elm Brook, and sparing no expense for the convenience of its employees and for sanitary considerations, the B&M erected an outhouse on that bridge over Elm Brook, and that is what you see next to the switch stand. Well, here's an inbound train. Boarding was always on the reformatory branch side of the depot. Here's an inbound getting ready to leave in the morning. This would have been the third. Actually, this is the Patriot. This would have been the third of the 4 inbound trains in the 1952 morning. Back in the foreground is to Billerica. You can see the train order signals on either end of the depot. We're looking to the west geographically. Here in 1955, Don Hills on Christmas Eve was out taking train pictures, and this mogul has powered the Saturday-only train 3207, which terminated at Billerica. There was no turning facilities there, and so it backed from there to Bedford, and here it is being watered before being put away for the night. Bedford Freight House on the left, depot in the right background. Bedford still, South Road in the foreground. We're looking geographic west toward the yard, which in the main track toward the reformatory branch. The preparation for the morning inbounds. The 2 locomotives are both Pacifics by this time, 1955. This is about a week before the scheduled official end of steam, which was, they said there was a year later, there was a brief curtain call. Engine in the center is on train 3212. And the engine on the left is coming off the Y. It will pull forward and then back onto the passenger cars you see in the center, and it will leave first as train 3210. On the building on the right was once called Middlesex Coal and Grain. By this time it was Middlesex Lumber and Fuel, and as I already mentioned, that building is still there. I'm afraid everything else in the picture is gone. So there's excitement in Bedford in 1873 when the standard gauge arrived in the form of the Middlesex Central, and there was much excitement again 4 years later with the arrival of the 2-foot gauge. Billerica and Bedford Railroad, which came in from North Billerica. Map on the left has the normal orientation with north being toward the top. Narrow gauge came in from Billerica, as you see, across Loomis Street. There was a Y. Off the Y was a track that went toward the Middlesex Central Depot, and that's where passengers could transfer between the narrow and standard gauge. In the middle of the Y was a two-stall engine house that was the home of the Billerica and Bedford's pair of little 12-ton Forneys, one of which is shown on the top right. And it's that engine house from 1877 that later became a Boston and Lowell, and then Boston and Maine freight house, and then other things, and that is preserved today as the freight house in Bedford Depot Park. Well, a lot has been written about the Billerica and Bedford. It was a pioneering 2-foot gauge common carrier, and every narrow gauge railroad seems to have more than its share of fans. Here, what I've done is to unravel its schedule to show the sequence of trains operated by each of 2 crews that had to be working each day. Both engines had to be in service for its very intensive schedule. There were 15 daily trains running between Bedford and North Billerica. And the details here are unimportant, but what I want to point out, which doesn't seem to have been recognized by previous authors, is the schedule is very carefully crafted to provide close connections with a standard gauge, both at Bedford, with the Middlesex Central, and in North Billerica with the Boston and Lowell. And they were 12 of the 15 trains, they had connections that were required 10-minute or less wait. So we're back in Bedford now. We're back up to 1939, and we're going to take a little trip on the reformatory branch to Concord. This is actually 12 years after the last passenger train, or 13 years after the last passenger train operated out there. So we're going to have to follow the BB on one of its side trips to Concord. A couple miles west of Bedford was West Bedford, rather modest facilities there, an open air station. I'm not sure the date of the station, probably taken after passenger service there ended. The underpass is under Bedford's Concord Road, now Route 62. The underpass is created so that the trolley line, which was on the road, would not have a grade crossing with the railroad, which preceded it. And then with the abandonment of the railroad in 1962, the road grade was lowered again. And so cyclists which follow that path out today, again, have to face at their own peril a road grade crossing. Here's looking back underneath the overpass, looking geographically east, later local. The depot was gone by then, and it would have been to the right of the engine if it's still been there. Concord, when the track was first extended there in 1873, had a turntable and an engine house and probably more trackage than you see here in the upper left in 1914. It soon lost its operational importance. It lost its engine terminal in 1883 when the Middlesex Central and Boston Lowell decided to establish one in Bedford. So Concord thereafter was kind of a sleepy place. Here's a 1939 local in the lower right arriving in Concord. By then the depot had been retired and sold to the Concord Herald newspaper. So you see no train order signals, a car parked there on the platform. In the distance was the main surviving customer, Whitney Coal and Grain, which actually lasted right up until the branch was abandoned in 1962. The lower left is so the lower right is you're looking back toward Bedford along the track, and the lower left we're standing on Monument Street where the photographer was, and looking into the yard from that direction. Well, no passenger train had operated on the reformatory branch since 1926, but that changed with an RRE chart, a very memorable one in July 1958. 2 months after RDCs took over passenger service on the branch, and the RRE arranged a charter that started out with the Lexington branch, a side trip on the reformatory branch, part of the Lexington branch, and then a tour of several other branches on up into southern New Hampshire that day. 3 RDCs are part of the train. The photo on the left is a view from that overpass that I showed you in West Bedford. The train is going away from the photographer. You can see that the track is looking kind of questionable by this point. As I said, there'd been no passenger service. There was some concern at the time over whether the overpass would actually clear the humps on the RDCs. It did. On the right is the train arriving at Lowell Road in Concord. Somebody's turned out in his 1911 Franklin to greet the train. The Concord Lumber Company office is still right there, looking like that. And although there's an addition to that occupies where the track was. Of course, it was a time when rail fans on charter still often wore coats and ties. Now, service beyond Concord Center ended in 1927, but it once went all the way to reformatory. There were 2 river crossings. The first was the Sudbury River. The second was the Assabet River. Here's I think my favorite early photo shows a train on the 3-span iron deck truss that crossed the Assabet with the crew, probably posing one of them atop a by then probably already obsolete 4-wheel boxcar. Reformatory, again, had a modest amount of trackage. The depot was interesting. It was a combination passenger depot and hotel, waiting room and restaurant on the first floor, hotel rooms on the second and third floor for visitors to the prison. On the top left photo and the distance between the track and the depot, you can see the back of the 3-stall engine house that was there. There was a turntable as well. Just beyond that was a spur that went into the prison for coal deliveries. You can see the location of the depot. And the photo on the top right, I think, although I'm not absolutely certain, was posed on the reformatory turntable, as with the one on the bridge in the previous slide, taken by Charles Hodgman, a photographer in the 1880s, had a studio in Bedford, so he was responsible for a few local train photos. Lower right, you see that on the right side, the prison was right across the street from the depot, and Elm Street is today's Route 2. The intersection of Barrett's Mill Road with Elm Street is now the route, the West Concord rotary on Route 2, and the prison is still there today. It's called MCI Concord. Well, we're back to Bedford. We've survived our side trip over the very questionable reformatory branch trackage, and we'll complete our journey with a trip up to Billerica on the Bedford and Billerica branch, again with a local freight. Today we have first car as an empty B&O hopper, suggesting a all-rail coal delivery from West Virginia, and then there's an empty Spokane, Portland, Seattle boxcar, suggesting probably a load of Douglas fir from Washington, Oregon to one of the local lumber yards. So off we go with the local. 2 miles north of Bedford Center was an interesting spot historically, although by the 1930s, when the photo on the left was taken, there wasn't much going on there. The depot would be torn down in a year or two. Beyond the depot and beyond the road on the left, you see a little freight house that was built to serve a company called the New York Pharmaceutical Company. It was one of the properties of a Dr. William Hayden, longtime Bedford resident, who had was quite influential in rail development in the area. He obtained a charter in 1869 for an extension of the Lexington and Arlington Railroad from Lexington to Bedford. And he was someone who was resourceful enough that I think that helped force the Boston and Lowell's hand and cause them to buy the Lexington and Arlington to prevent it from falling into someone else's hands who could then extend it easily to Lowell and compete with them on Lowell to Boston traffic. So he came into the picture, then. Now, when the standard gauge was built by the Middlesex Central, it didn't go to Bedford Springs, it went to Bedford Center, so he was still left without a railroad. But hold on, and when the narrow gauge was built in 1877, it ran through Bedford Springs. So then he had his railroad to serve his New York Pharmaceutical Company and a big summer resort that he had called the Sweetwater Hotel for people who wanted to bathe in and/or drink the mineral, the springs, or the water from the mineral springs there. The New York Pharmaceutical Company factory survives today as a set of condominiums, and that's shown there on the upper right. And see a little glimpse of Bedford's Fawn Lake. Hayden became, he was actually the second and last president of the narrow gauge when it was abandoned. And then once again, he surfaced once again in 1885 as one of the driving forces to help encourage the Boston and Lowell to finally build a standard gauge branch over part of the narrow gauge right away between Bedford and Billerica. And so he did get his standard gauge railroad to Bedford Springs at last. Skipped a couple of stations on the branch to Billerica. Here were the local is same local, 1952, is arriving here at Billerica Center, about ready to cross River Street, getting a roll by a young woman. The Billerica Center Depot in 1916 was still quite nice. So there was never a lot of rail traffic out of Billerica Center. And there was, in terms of trackage, there was only just a siding with a house track and a freight house track. About a mile north of there was the station called Bennett Hall. Here's our same local, smoking it up, approaching Boston Road and Bennett Hall. If you're a really careful observer, you notice there are two different cars on the front end of the train, two box cars that weren't there before, suggesting that there was a pickup from the house track at Billerica. Now, Bennett Hall was approaching another very significant location for the railroad, and I'll take you through the USGS map on the left. Coming up from the bottom center was the Lexington branch. You see Bennett Hall where it crossed Boston Road. The Lexington branch came north and up near the top left corner connected with the Boston to Lowell main line. The pond there with elevation 114 is very close to the North Billerica depot. The main line at this point still does make a sweeping S-curve around that area. In 1912, the B&M bought several hundred acres of land between the branch and the main line, and constructed there a system locomotive and car shop facilities, extremely extensive, that created actually a Y, the connection between the branch and the main line. It's designed originally so that equipment needing repair would come in from the main line and exit via the branch. I'm not sure that was always done that way, but that the shops became an important freight customer for the branch, not just because of supplies, but also of equipment that had to be delivered for repair. Huge locomotive shop, capability of lifting the largest locomotives at the time off their wheels and doing any repair you could imagine. Also huge car shops. The complex is shown in this Sanborn map from 1952. By then, some of the big buildings had been leased or sold, or I guess probably just leased to industrial customers that were still in place. Get a little bit of a sense for the size of the facility. A lot of it was still there, at least a couple of years ago when I was there with my camera. Top center is the now derelict locomotive shop. Top right, what was called the administration or administrative building, still in use. Although I think now I think it is still in use, although the Pan Am Railway sign is probably gone. There was a powerhouse, still some remnants of it then, and then the car and paint shops were also still largely intact. And the foreground was the car shop, and the background was the paint shop. There were about 8 or 10 tracks ran through the car shop, and they were connected by a transfer table so that some of the wooden equipment needing repair could be wheeled back and forth. Now, very oddly, the shops were not just a freight customer for the branch, they were a source of passenger traffic. And let me explain that. For many years, the B&M operated shuttles to the shops. So the shops, when they opened, employed 1,200 men and probably increased a little bit after that. And that was almost half the population of Billerica. So most people lived elsewhere. And so the B&M provided shuttles for employees who lived in Boston and ones who lived in Lowell. And the way that it worked in different ways in different times, but around 1950, though, it worked this way. Shop employees in Lowell would board at the Middlesex terminal north of the Lowell Depot, ride down on the special shop train to North Billerica, where there'd be a stop. There, shop employees from Boston who'd ridden a regularly scheduled train, maybe with a couple of extra coaches up from Boston, and gotten off there, would then board the shop train and then go back south again to the shop entrance. They'd go to work. The locomotive crew would do switching for the industrial customers or the remaining shops. And then in the afternoon, they would back out of the shops onto the Lexington branch and return to Lowell. And the photo on the left here is a very rare shot by John Boardman of the shops train returning in the afternoon toward Lowell and approaching where it joined the main line at North Billerica. The late Ralph Fisher, in one of his pieces, commented that the dedicated shops train coaches were all decrepit and beat up, and maybe they were a little decrepit inside, but I think a lot of tourist railroads would give a lot to have equipment in that condition today, wood coaches like that. Well, here's where the branch ended in North Billerica. From right to left, you've got the double track Maine and then the Lexington branch, which actually ran right next to the depot. The branch paralleled for, I don't know, half a mile or so the main line before joining it, or south of where the photographer's camera is pointed north. So it ran along the main line for a while before this point. The branch, which is shown in red on the track map, actually didn't terminate until about a quarter mile or so north of the depot. And although the depot was technically a mainline station, as far as the Boston, Maine was concerned, it was the freight house, and the customer sightings there were actually part of the Lexington branch. There's a happy story here on the lower right, the North Billerica Depot, which dates from the 1870s and had been retired by the railroads, sold to a lumber company, become derelict, reacquired by the MBTA, was on the verge of being torn down, and through a heroic effort by Billerica town historian Margaret Ingraham, was restored, and it's today again a viable commuter stop on for folks traveling into Boston. What else has been preserved? The Lexington Depot, fortunately, was saved. It was retired in 1959, sold to a bank. It was a bank office until the 1990s, when it was acquired by the Lexington Historical Society, which has restored it and continues to take good care of it. The bikeway runs through the train shed, as you can see on the right. The white paint is similar to the appearance of the depot during its last years of service. So I'll end with some comments about railroad preservation in Bedford. It can be said to have begun on April 1st, 1992. That's the day when, as he told it to me, my late colleague Jim Shea was driving to work and saw the heavy equipment tearing up the track remnants near the Bedford depot in preparation for the completion of the bikeway. The track had been unused for 15 years, but it was now being finally dismantled. That day, Jim said he got the idea that it'd be a shame for the railroad to vanish from Bedford without a trace, and began to think about what could be done about it. Within a couple of years, he started thinking, well, maybe Bedford could acquire a rail car for display in the depot area. And he contacted the MBTA, and they had just 3 left. They're all sitting in the woods on out-of-the-way sidings in North Billerica, and Bedford was offered its choice of the 3 for $1. After an inspection with the help of Dan O'Brien, who was headed passenger car maintenance for the BM, Bedford chose, or Jim and Dan chose, the 6211 as being the most restorable, although it too was heavily vandalized, not knowing at the time that it had regularly operated on the branch. At the same time, in 1994, the bikeway was being completed, and this little wood frame building at the end of the bikeway I've mentioned previously, it was originally the narrow gauge engine house. It became the B&M freight house, and went through other uses, and then by the 1990s was this little bake shop. In the distance, you can see the depot. The depot had also gone into private hands by the late 50s. The contractor who bought it had added a second floor inside, changed all the window and door openings, and by the 1990s, it was still there. In fact, the train order signal masts on the 2 ends are still there even, but it was beginning to look kind of tired. The Bedford yard then was a mess. This is looking east toward the bakery and where the side of the depot. The yard was overgrown. The track here did not have to be torn up immediately for the bikeway, and it was not. The Middlesex Coal and Grain building was still standing there on the left, but this was not an attractive part of town at the time. It was not certainly that it could cause people to want to visit that part of Bedford. Well, to make a long story very short, several grant applications, over $1 million of federal historic preservation funding, and the town getting behind the project, town of Bedford. Thousands of hours of volunteer work and some work by contractors. By 2009, the freight house and the rail car looked like this. This is part of today's Bedford Depot Park complex, and the organization I'm involved with, the Friends of Bedford Depot Park, makes this accessible to the public on summer weekends. Our office is up in the attic there, in the freight house. The depot took a little bit longer to restore. Remember what it looked like? The original style of windows and doors has been replicated. The only non-authentic thing on the outside is the platform, which had to be added for accessibility purposes. The train order signals have been rebuilt, although they're no longer operable. Semaphores are back in place, and LEDs light the roundels, and we even have them lit at night. So that's Bedford Depot Park. Many of the thousands of hours were spent restoring the 6211. You saw how vandalized the interior was. Here it is, the way it looks today. Half of it is original condition inside. The other half is sort of museum displays, including reproductions of Bud's advertising postage from the 1950s for its RDCs. So here's the 6211 laying over in the Bedford yard in 1960 on an evening. Middlesex coal and grain in the background, the depot in the far background distance. And here it is today. It's a static display, and in the distance is the old coal and grain dealer, is now a bike shop, and it's one of the historic buildings preserved there. So my book was published by Friends of Bedford Depot Park Incorporated. I'm currently acting president of that group, and you can learn more about us by going to our website. Hope you do that. Hope some of you will choose to order my book on the Lexington branch. And if any of you want to reach me with questions about the organization or the book or the Lexington branch, feel free to shoot me an email at the address at the bottom. So that's all. Thanks for your attention. I realize I ran a little long, but I hope parts of it are interesting.
Everybody can't applaud, but I will. Thank you so much, Bill. A fascinating presentation. We only have 2 questions in the Q&A. Probably go back a little bit. Matt Menzie asked, was the New England Brick Company the same company that owned the factory on the old WNP in Gonick, New Hampshire?
Don't know. I know it's Cambridge history, but not. It was a regional manufacturer. I think they operated in, at least they had brick sales yards, I think as far west as New York State. But I really don't know the whole scope of what they did.
And Bill, we had several Bills on, so I'm not quite sure which one this is, says, can you comment on that box pony truss in Arlington Heights?
Arlington Heights. Okay. So this is the...
it might have been around slide 55 or something like that.
Probably the Park Avenue overpass in Arlington Heights.
I think that would be it, yes.
I can get back to that, yes.
It was somewhere before like 36.
Yeah, fortunately it's in geographic order, so I can scroll back to that spot. Well, actually, let's go back to probably the best view of it was the early picture of the double track, heavy duty, rail line. So here, let's look at this.
Yep.
I won't go back to the play mode, so I think hopefully this.
No, that's fine.
Will be good enough. So the overpass in the foreground is Park Avenue. The one in the distance is Lowell Road. And what was the interest there in that first? Bridge?
Well, the question was just, can you comment on it? So I'm not quite sure what.
I don't know much about it. I think it's correct. It was a covered pony truss. It's no longer there today. The abutments are there today, although they may or may not actually be supporting the new bridge. But I don't know I'm afraid I know more about the history of the stairway than I know about the history of the Park Avenue Bridge. It was the overpass was built there right around 1900 as part of a big grade separation project in Arlington when there were 60 steam trains per day.
Okay, and John Gilman wants to know when was Saturday and Sunday passenger service discontinued on the branch?
Gee, I'd have to look at my notes. I think Sunday service was discontinued very soon after the arrival of the trolleys, but probably before 1910, between 1900, maybe even 1905. Saturday passenger service lasted until the post-World War II years. It was not completely eliminated until around until the late 40s. Maybe even early 50s. Again, I'd have to look at my notes on that. but Sunday service was eliminated very early.
Richard Monahan asks, when was the Bedford Billerica narrow gauge replaced by standard gauge track?
That was the extension, the sort of the upper right fork of the branch that was built in 1885. So the many of you know that after the Billerica and Bedford narrow gauge was abandoned in 1878, it was torn up immediately and became the equipment that was the seed for the Sandy River Railroad in Maine. The most of the branch right-of-way became available then, and when the Boston and Lowell came back with an interest in connecting Bedford and Billerica with a standard gauge in the early 1880s, and of course wanting a subsidy from the towns and getting a modest subsidy, they were able to reuse most of the narrow gauge right away, although not all of it. The right away going up to the top of the hill in Billerica Center, if anybody knows Billerica, it's on the center of the town, is on the top of the hill, and the narrow gauge had done a very circuitous looping approach to that, and it was not practical for a standard gauge. So that part was not used, but much of the rest of the right-of-way was used by the Boston and Lowell for the standard gauge.
Okay, questions are coming in more now. Ed Sterling asks, is anything visible of the reformatory branch as you drive by the prison on Route 2 today?
Absolutely nothing that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I was looking on the Google satellite view, and much of the reformatory branch is pretty well surrounded by woods now. So it
is. I gather, although I've not been there, I gather that on some of the private property approaching Reformatory Station, probably after the second river crossing, that some of the right-of-way is still discernible in the woods, but that's it. There is no trace. There was even no trace when the former New Haven line was still in place west of the prison. No trace of where Middlesex Junction had ever been. The only way to find it was just to, pace it off or measure it.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're getting near the end here. It's also getting close to 10 o'clock. We do have it's actually a comment on the Q&A from Lucius. Would love to see a light rail extension out there. Is enough of the right-of-way still contiguous to support this? Maybe even extend from the Summerville Union Square Station to the Green Line extension. I suspect the answer to that is it'll be a cold day in hell.
Yeah, that's the short answer. That's the longer answer is it was an extension of the Red Line out to actually to Lexington and maybe even beyond Route 128 was under very serious consideration in the 1970s. In fact, the engineering design had been done for an extension from Harvard Square along its present route through West Cambridge and all the way out to Arlington Heights. There was tremendous community opposition to it, especially in Arlington. There was a non-binding referendum in which was overwhelmingly negative about having a subway terminal in anywhere in Arlington, including Arlington Heights. Although it was non-binding, the MBTA took that to heart and abandoned plans of extending the Red Line into Arlington, although the tunnel from Alewife still goes in that direction where the trains are stored. And so the terminal ended up as being in Alewife in West Cambridge. Cambridge, by the way, at the time was not all that happy about having that Red Line extension there also. And So yes, it was seriously considered. It was, as I said, even the extension beyond Route 128 to the, if one knows where Hartwell Avenue in Lexington is today, it would have been a great location for a park and ride area, but that never happened. What became of the right of way is that it's still owned by the MBTA. The track was never officially abandoned. It's officially rail banked. It's now the Minuteman Bikeway, and it's very unlikely, I think, given the anticipated traffic density, that it would ever, well, first of all, that people would give up the bikeway voluntarily, and that it would ever be, the money would be put into extending the
Yeah, and ironically,
red line or either at mass transit out that far.
Ironically, in terms of number of people who traverse the branch, probably it's orders of magnitude greater volume of people using it now than ever used it, even at the peak of rail service.
Well, yeah, maybe or maybe not. It probably is in the thousands. I don't know if any accurate counts, but yeah, it does get a lot of use. And so I think that helps make it very unlikely that it would be converted to any form of light rail or heavy rail.
We do have a last question here. I think we're going to need to wrap things up here. Bill asks, can you mention I guess it's New York Central gas electric car that's stored on the reformatory branch in Concord?
Oh, yeah. For a while, there was a car stored just short of the bridge over the Sudbury River that had been removed, and it was I'm having a senior moment here, trying to remember the name of the person I knew who used it as a residence in the early 50s. Anyway, it was stored there for a while, and it was moved in the late 50s. It had really nothing to do with the Lexington branch history, so I chose not to mention it in my book, although it was kind of an interesting place to set up residence there at the end of the track.
I just want to thank everybody for sticking around for the presentation.